Hey folks, it's Rob Flux here with another Sunday session, and today we're talking about property management, but more specifically, property management with a development perspective in mind. So we're going to cover all of the ground-based work that we need to from a property development perspective, just to round out the topic. But then we're going to give you, at the end of the conversation, some tips and tricks when you are a developer, some of the things that you want to start to consider both in buying a property and also in selling the property at the end, and how that's going to do. And in order to do that, we've got an expert who's going to help us to go through and navigate that. So Alex Tinsley from Master Real Estate. So Alex, welcome to the show, mate.
G'day, Rob. Thank you very much for having me.
Mate, more than welcome. Good to have you on board. Mate, tell me firstly a little bit about you, who you are, who Master Real Estate are, so that everyone's got some context as to why we should be believing you as the expert in this topic, mate.
Yeah, absolutely. Master Real Estate is a property management focused agency. So a bit different to a lot of other agencies out there that has sales going on and then property management is an afterthought. But we look after all of Sydney and we really specialize in having owners who have multiple properties all around the city, and they want to have like that standard of service the whole way through.
Perfect. Now, because we are a national audience and because you are a Sydney specific thing, from time to time, I'm going to chip in and say, hey, that's not quite the same everywhere. So feel free to do exactly the same for yourself wherever you know that that's the case, mate, because I'm going to guess that you know more than me in some of these instances.
Yeah, there's certainly a bit of difference in some of the states at the moment. So yeah, no, absolutely, not a problem.
All good, mate, all good. So, okay, firstly, what the hell is a property manager and what the hell do you do?
So a property manager is essentially someone who you outsource your time and energy to look after your investment property, right? So they do a variety of things, but essentially they maximize your rent, they minimize your damages, your costs, they mitigate your risk, and really big important part of that, of course, is like tenant selection and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, very good. So, well, let's start with the first one of those 4 dot points that you just mentioned, maximizing rents. We all want to maximize our rent. We want to have our properties generating the most amount of revenue for us. As property developers, we tend to be buying properties and trading them in the short term, but long term, we want to keep stock ourselves and generate rent as passive cash flow. That's our ultimate goal. Now, I'll give a little formula for everybody out there who's not heard me say this before. If you are doing a 20% profit on cost and you do a 6-pack of something, then if you sell 5, it should pay down the costs, and the 6th one should be free, which means that's the rent generating one that we want to do. That's the one you're going to give to Alex and his team or some other property manager around the country. So, mate, how do we maximize the rent? Because that's what we're here for.
Yeah, so there's 3 things that you need to look at when you're maximizing your rent. The first is price, the second is presentation, and the third is promotion. So price, of course, we all know it's how much per week that the property costs based on rooms, features, fixtures, location, and all those things. And all of that goes together into formulating a really good price. Then you've got presentation. So how does the property actually present when you're on site? Is it a warm and friendly environment? Is there paint peeling off the walls? Is there mold in that corner? All those little things that create the presentation when someone visits the property and they decide whether or not they're going to rent it. And then third, you've got the promotion. So that's your advertising, your online photos, video, copy, all of those things that go together. And you've got to make sure that all 3 things are in alignment in order to create the best result for you, or your best outcome for your rent, right? So fantastic promotion only goes so far. You've got to also have fantastic presentation. We've all walked into those properties and gone, oh God, this looks nothing like the photos, right? So those 2 things will actually reduce your price immediately, because people have that negativity when they walk into the property, right? And the thing that you have the ability to control in the short term, almost within immediacy, is price, right? So if those 2 things aren't in alignment, you can reduce your price and vice versa.
Very good, mate. And I've seen many instances where the presentation and the promotion don't align, because you can get your photos enhanced. You can send them off to places like Box Brownie or other places where they digitally enhance them, take away the clutter. They, change the color of the sky, all those sorts of things. And what you see on the picture is not necessarily what happens on the tin, right? So.
Oh, absolutely. I have a little story, actually. Many years ago, I took over a property from another agency, and in the previous ad, they had said water views, water views, water views, water views. And I walked into the property with the owner and I said, listen, I'm sorry, I don't see where are the water views from this property? And we worked out that you did get a water view if you stood on the bathroom toilet and looked out the window and there was a water view.
Oh, the glimpses.
Glimpses, yes, exactly. So it's little things like that it's going to create that sort of environment. So putting those things together get you the best result.
Yeah, very good, mate. Now, in some states, I know that this is possible, but I believe it's not the case in New South Wales. Rental auctions, when the market is in a buying frenzy or rental frenzy, what can we do here, mate?
So you want to avoid a rental auction because it's considered illegal, but also because, above all else, but also because if you have an overblown rental amount for that first time, people tend to forget that that's not actually what it was worth. Like from a market perspective, you might get a couple of people who are they absolutely love it, they have to have it, and they go up against each other, back and forth, and that will overblow the price, which then causes your issue when it comes up for rental next time, because you were expecting to get that price, you might not get it again. So you've got to keep that in mind. It's very important. If you do end up having a situation where someone walks in and offers $100 more, because it does happen, and remembering, okay, yeah, no, this is a price that I'm getting because of the market that we're in today. This market might not last to the next cycle or the next time that it goes around. This happened in the last 2 years as well, where people were getting really cheap prices, right? And then they're getting served rental increases now for what the actual market rent is. And they're like, oh, but it's been $500 a week now. Why am I getting a rental increase for $650? It's like, well, this is what it's worth now. So you've got to keep a
discount for a while. That's what it was.
Exactly. You've had a discount for a while. In the same way that if you get, a very, very hot market, you might get a premium for a while.
Understood, very much so. But you did give I guess, an interesting concept there. Somebody comes and voluntarily says, I'll pay more. Is that technically an auction? How does that work? Do you just change the ad, add another $100 on the ad? Then it wasn't an auction. How do you get around things like that?
No, we so typically speaking, if we got a short list of people who are the best quality tenants, I might go to one of them, two of them, and say, hey, listen, this is where we're at, and try and get them up to the same amount. What you don't want to have happen is when an auction happens, when one person offers more and then another person offers more and then more and then more and then more. If you can get everyone up to a level playing field and you say, okay, property was initially listed at $575 a week. We're now at $610. Everyone's at $610. We can now make a informed decision based on the quality of that tenant, because price is no longer important. It's the quality of the tenant that you're then choosing between, which is more important for the longevity of your investment.
Very diplomatic, mate. Very diplomatic.
Well, one tries.
Okay, so what about situations we're trying to maximize our cash flow still? Are there any little idiosyncrasies or creativity things that we can actually do in the lease to kind of squeeze the lemon a little bit harder and get just that little bit more out of it? What are some tips and tricks that we can do in writing the lease?
Yeah. So not too long ago, I had there's a couple of different things you can do to be a bit more creative in terms of your lease terms. So a lot of people go into it thinking, I'm going to sign a 12-month lease and it's going to start on this date and so on and so forth, and it's going to be fixed price. You can talk about rent increases, and you can talk about having a staggered rent increase for a longer term as well. So I had a situation, as I was saying, where I ended up signing a 3-year lease with 3% increases across year on year in that lease. And the tenant was kind of not fussed because that was future him problem. But he ended up actually paying significantly higher rent in the third year, and he will pay significantly higher rent in the third year because we've managed to negotiate that. And it's put in place a really solid strategy for that owner so that they end up having this fantastic cash flow, whether or not the market dips or falls or whatever in the next 3 years.
Well, that's a compounding interest type situation, because it's 3% this year, and then it's 3% on top of that previous 3+%, last 3 plus the original baseline, and then the last year is 3% of the 3% on top of the 3% plus the base. So it does compound very quickly. So very clever, mate.
Yeah, no, it was a great outcome for that particular landlord, because They were concerned about the volatility in the market, and being that we've just gone through 2 years of a lot of volatility. And yeah, so it was a great outcome.
What about periods where you're coming into either a holiday period or a seasonal period or something like that? What should we do to kind of, we want the longer leases where we can, but what should we do to kind of navigate so that at the end of the lease, it doesn't land in that seasonal period again?
Yeah, very, very important. So leasing is seasonal. You've got the low period is in winter and then the high period is in summer. But just before, usually a week before the holiday period, the market crashes out and then jumps back up again in the second week, usually second week of January, first or second week of January, depending on where the weekends sit. And if you are signing a lease that's going to come up for renegotiation or a potential vacancy over the holiday period, you're pretty much dooming yourself, because not only are people usually not looking for accommodation at that point, most real estate agencies close over the holiday period. So you're not going to get a tenant for 7-10 days, right? So signing a 13 or 14 month lease, if you're coming up for renegotiation at that point, you're going to take yourself over that period and actually set yourself into the highest part of the market. And it's a really clever way to get over that potential vacancy issue with the holiday period.
Very good. Now, I'm a developer. I'm creating lots of stock. I'm going to sell all of my, I guess, a lot of my finished product to someone, and I'm going to keep something for myself, as we said before, for that rent. How do I make sure that my lease doesn't expire at the same time as all these other brand new properties are going to lease at the exact same time? Because I don't want to be competing with, I guess, the clients that I sold to. That's not good.
No, exactly. It's all about supply, right? So if you've got this enormous amount of supply hitting at the market at the same time, price is going to come down, as you said. So what you do is you sign a 9-month lease or a 15-month lease to make sure that you're off cycle. So that people who are signing 6 and 12-month leases, which are standard, you're not coming up for renegotiation or potential vacancy or going to market, most importantly, during that period.
And the off cycle, whether it's 9 or 15, we want to make sure that it doesn't land in around the holiday period. So that's kind of we need to compound those things together to make sure that it works.
So it's actually thinking quite far ahead sometimes and into the future and when things will work out and so on and so forth. It's really important.
Yeah, so it's very strategic thinking with regards to how and when we're actually going to be future marketing the product. It's not just about what we're doing today. It's about how we're actually going to roll that out over a period of time.
Yeah, definitely.
Mate, then comes, I guess, as part of the maximising our rent, we actually have to get a tenant in here. We need to make sure they're the right kind of tenant. How do we go through the process of determining the right kind of tenant? What are the things that we're looking for? How do we, I guess, weed out the good from the bad?
Yeah, your application for tenancy is the most important thing in this particular issue, right? So we apply for things all the time. We apply for jobs, we apply for memberships, and a lot of people think, oh, I have to apply for another property, but remember, you're entering into a contractual relationship with someone, right? So they've seen your side of the deal, of the bargain. They've seen what you can do, which is the property. They've got to then prove that they're able to service the lease that is being offered to them. So there's 4 things, generally speaking, that you're going to look for when you have someone apply for tenancy. Number 1 is that they've got to prove who they are, 100 points of ID. So, passport, driver's license, all those things. I often do Google searches to make sure that the person exists on various forms of social media, LinkedIn, so on and so forth. All of that's very important. Once you've gone past that, then you've got your proof of employment. So cash flow is really important when you're a tenant because you've got to be paying the lease. There's a rule of thumb in terms of how much rent can be a part of your income, and that's 1/3. Any more than 1/3 of your income, and it's considered rent stress. Now, that can be sort of mitigated with the next point, which is proof of funds. So if you've got a lot of money sitting in the bank account, then maybe you don't need to have as high income. But we want to be seeing, your last 3 pay slips or your contract of employment to prove that the money coming in. And then I want to be seeing a bank statement for proof of funds. That's points 2 and 3. So your proof of funds needs to show at least 6 weeks worth of rent in any bank account. Not all property managers will read through the entire of your bank statement. I haven't always. I have caught people, though, in the past who deposit a lot of money into an account in order to show that they've got money for rental. Making sure that they've at least got that so they can enter into the agreement is really important. And then finally, the fourth point is their proof of tenancy history. So any ledger that they might have or anything that shows that they are a good tenant, references, that sort of thing, they come together to create confidence in that person's capability of looking after a tenancy.
Well, any reference that I've ever had for any job I've ever gone for, you only ever give someone who's going to say good stuff. How many stories have you got where people have not actually thought through who their reference was?
Yeah, so there's a couple of them. It's not happened to me in a long time, but there's a couple of the interesting systems that you can use to process applications that will tell you whether or not a reference request came from the same IP address as the person applying, for example. So there's a couple of interesting, there's a company out there that does that as part of the reference requesting. Or, you'll call and they'll say, oh, who is this? And then suddenly their voice switches and they go, oh, yes, I'm expecting your call. I'm like, that's your friend. I know this is your friend. You know what I mean? So I typically Google the reference giver as well to make sure that they are who they say they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also, I guess, all of the black market registers. So ticker, so not black market, black mark registers. So ticker, not sure what ticker stands for, but that's basically a large database that actually stores people's rental history and, when there've been complaints and issues and challenges and that sort of thing. Is ticker the only thing out there, or are there a couple of other things like ticker?
There are a few. Tikka's the largest of them, but there's one that's maintained. There's another private one maintained, at least that I know of in New South Wales through TApp here. But yeah, Tikka is the biggest, most commonly used one because it's they've developed that database over very many years. I think they've got something like 7 million records or something like that. So that's a lot of people that have been registered in the past. So that's probably the best one. And you just want to make sure that you're not seeing someone's name on it, because that means at some point they've had an issue in the past, right? Yeah. So yeah, you want to make sure that they're not featured on that. There are some of the ones where you do a credit check, like a background credit check. This is one. There's oh god, I can't remember the name of the company, but they'll tell you if they've got outstanding court debts and stuff like that, or if they've ever declared themselves bankrupt. So paying the $25 for one of them and then the $29 for the other, it can be really worth your while.
Yeah. So the PPSR register, I think, is one of the ones that you're referencing.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah. What about sometimes a tenant is just too good to be true? Like they know the right things, they say the right things. Is it possible that you can have a tenant who's a little bit too savvy and a little bit too on the ball with regards to what they should be saying and doing? Yeah,
there's a certain element when you do an inspection with a prospective tenant that you do slightly interview them. You get to know them really, really well. But my little red flag does go up if someone is really well scripted, and when they talk a lot about maybe the legislation or stuff like that, or things that have happened to them in the past where they've done this, that, and the other. Very, very savvy tenants can game the system. They can be really, really hard to deal with because they will absolutely refuse to be cooperative because they know that the legislation is very much in their favor. So sometimes they can be more trouble than they're worth.
I understand. So things like breaking leases and knowing what their rights are under that, because in New South Wales in particular, I know that the break lease fees are very minimal, and so I guess the ability for them to get out of something and not get hurt, whereas us as landlords end up paying the bill for that. So break leases, what is appropriate, what can be done, what can't be done, that sort of thing?
So most people are not aware that breaking your lease as a tenant is completely legal, and it's actually written into the lease. There's certain fines, fees, or penalties for every quarter of the lease that you're in, and then how much you are then liable for. So the tenant, for example, who breaks their lease in the first quarter, they're liable for 4 weeks rent in New South Wales. Second quarter is 3 weeks rent. Third quarter is 2 weeks. And then the last quarter, that last 90 days, is only 1 week's rent. It's also not a requirement to give any notice. You can walk into the real estate agency, drop your keys on the desk, tell them that you're leaving, pay your 1 week, and then basically leave. And that is a very insecure point to be if you are an investor. If you know in the last 90 days, your tenant can literally just leave with almost zero penalty. 1 week's rent's not much, right?
No, it's terrible.
That keeps you in a place of insecurity. So when you do have tenants who are maybe a little bit more savvy and you're aware of this, it's important that you strategize how you deliver notice for certain things, right? So, for example, you won't be issuing a notice of rent increase in that last 90 days. You might wait for it to go on to the periodic terms of the lease. So once you're past your fixed term, it's 21 days notice minimum for them to leave. So you've got a little bit of a buffer there. If the tenant does decide to leave, they're liable for 21 days. You can rent it out in that time.
Yeah, so we'll just re-clarify that for those that, because we went pretty quick.
Yeah.
If it's a fixed period lease, then in that last quarter, they don't need to give any notice. But as soon as it rolls over to a periodic lease, then the rules change and now it's back in our favor and now it's 21 days.
Yeah.
So it's you, I guess, as the property manager, understanding those elements and go, well, we don't want to trigger the fact that they could run away at any moment and give us no notice, but rather if we want that rent increase, we're going to wait until it goes onto periodic, then ask, because then they have to give us the extra requirement. And if I'm assuming that if they still leave at that point or choose to leave that 21 days, if they just scarper at that point, we're going to take that out of their bond. So
yes.
Yeah.
So the bond is a resource which, it's not really supposed to be used as rent, but it often does, because you have situations exactly like you just said, where people leave and it's not something that they weren't intending to pay at any point. Bond is, of course, always 4 weeks rent in New South Wales, at least, and it's held in trust with the bond board. So we never see it. It's always held in trust, and you've got to go through a whole process of claiming items from the bond. But in terms of the resource of that, it's fantastic because you've got something secure. Now, there's arguments to be made about whether that's enough. I know that there's always, in the past, there's been something called a pet bond, which is something that was used a lot and has recently been basically made illegal, unfortunately, because, as we all know, pets can be quite damaging to a property. But you are still allowed to refuse a tenant in New South Wales, at least, if they have a pet. I know that in other states, however, that's no longer the case as of this year, I think.
Yeah, well, it's changed in Victoria and also in Queensland, where pets are absolutely allowed. We'll go into pets in 2 seconds. There was one thing that we kind of tripped over or raced past rather than tripped over. When we're talking about breaking lease, there's opportunities there as a developer where there might be a tenant already in place, where we want that tenant to leave because, we've already got our development approval. We're ready to knock the house down and do the work that we want to do and that sort of thing. I guess in those situations, the lease is actually live. We want to try and encourage that tenant to say, hey, now's the right time to go. So inviting them to break the lease and I guess not paying the fine or the fee and just waiving that is always to our advantage, as is incentivizing the tenant to, potentially move on quicker by maybe paying their relocation costs or something along those lines. So you always have to factor in, if we wait, they give the required notice, what's our holding cost for the project, folks? Have we calculated that out? And the break fee or the relocation costs, that's probably less than the holding costs of us holding the property in the first instance. Yeah,
absolutely. And if you've developed a good relationship with your tenant from the very beginning, and they know that the plan is eventually you're going to develop the property or the land or what have you, often they're prepared. They know that this is going to happen, and they're more than happy to move on when you have the time is right and you're willing to pay their costs. Because ultimately, that's probably the most important thing that they're worried about is the inconvenience and the cost of having to move.
And where appropriate, put in the intention for the development, and that when the notification comes through, that you will give them shorter notice to get out where you can. But I've had a particular circumstance that has impacted me in doing something like that, where it was actually very poorly written, because what we were doing is we were battle axing the rear of the property.
Okay.
And so we wrote the lease in such a way to say they were only renting the front half of the property.
Right.
And so this is a bad mistake, folks. Don't do this at home if you're listening to me. By doing so, they controlled the front half of the property and were refusing me access to the back half of the property because I wasn't able to trespass against their property, which then meant I couldn't actually get through. So if you are going to put any special conditions, make sure that your solicitor, firstly, that you're using a solicitor, and secondly, that they're good, because that one was not, and they no longer have my business.
Wow.
Yes, you can always get caught. But we were talking about pets, mate. That's where we were going. So big segue. So in New South Wales, you guys can refuse pets coming on to lease, as I understand it.
That's correct.
But Victoria and Queensland can't. New legislation in both of those jurisdictions in the last couple of years. But given that you either A, can't refuse in those states, or B, may elect to actually allow someone to in New South Wales, what sort of provisions could or should we actually put into the lease in order to protect ourselves against any damage, given that we can't do the pet bond?
Yes, there's some prescribed wording in the actual lease around pets, and you've got to fill in saying how many and what type and so on and so forth. It's quite loose, at least in New South Wales. I prefer to have an additional term at the very end, which explains to the tenant that they are liable for damages caused by the pet over the life of the tenancy. And that, for example, if you've got a large dog in a property and you've got hardwood flooring, you may require them to sand the floors on the way out. Or if you've got a property with a cat and you're carpeted, then you're making sure that they get the carpet steam cleaned and sanitized, not just steam cleaned, also sanitized afterwards, in case of cat urine or something like that. And then probably the most important thing after those, tackling those little items is a general pest control, because the last thing that you want is for a new tenant to walk into a property and they're still, have either fleas or they've got, an allergy to that particular type of pet and they can't stay there because they're, all blocked up or whatever. So a pest control, and then also tackling all of those damages as well. Very important.
Yeah. I mean, I can speak from personal experience. The fact that somebody can mandatorily bring in a pet and I have no control over that is not attractive. However, what I would say is it broadens your tenant pool, because there's lots of people that actually want to have. So it's a balance between, look, you want to be able to open it up and allow people to actually live a life. We don't want to punish people for having to live in a rental property, but at the same time, you want to be able to control, I guess, the kind of pet. I don't want a Great Dane. I'd be happy for some cute little lap dog, but unfortunately, a lot of that control has been taken away from us in a lot of Australia. You guys are the last bastion. New South Wales is the last bastion of control. I'm wondering, have you heard any remnants in the grapevine? Is there any rumblings of that being taken away, mate?
I have heard rumblings. I've heard lots of people with concerns over, because there's the other changes that have been made in Victoria with regards to notice periods and so on and so forth. They've been talking about implementing here as well. So from my perspective, if they're going to implement that, they're probably also going to implement the pet stuff as well. We had some changes to our strata because we used to rely very heavily on strata to decline stuff in the past, and we'd always blame them because, you know, they're the faceless men of a strata committee. So we can just say, oh, the strata didn't approve you, sorry, you can't move in. It's a bit easier. But yeah, now that they can't either, but landlords still can, we've got to sort of be the last group to say, you know what, I don't want something like this in my property or not. I mean, I wonder sometimes if it's a little bit the pendulum swinging, you know, sometimes too far one way or the other. And if there's going to be, you know, moving backwards in those states, because I've just been hearing, and I'm a part of groups on Facebook, and I've been hearing so many stories of just like horror stories where they literally have Great Danes in 1-bedroom units, and you know, the floors getting completely ripped up and curtains getting chewed and stuff like that.
Well, it's an interesting point where you say the pendulum swinging both ways, because what tends to be happening is that there are less people wanting to own investment properties because of the fact that they're losing control, which means that there's less rental stock, which means that the cost of rent is going up, which means affordable housing's not working, and the governments are going, oh, what do we do about people being able to afford to live? And, you know, 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2. Sometimes it's the death by 1,000 paper cuts. All of these little things adding up is making that somewhat challenging. So if you are a legislator out there, please let it be known that you're losing landlords because of legislation that are done poorly like this, and not having the appropriate, I guess conversations.
Checks and balances.
Checks and balances, absolutely. So, you know, I highly say yes, pets in properties are a good idea. It broadens the pool, but there's got to be some balances. Maybe it's as simple as putting the pet bonds in to say, well, if you're going to force them to come in, then you know, protect the property. Those sorts of things I think would help. But end of rant.
No, I totally agree with you. I totally agree. And if we're talking specifically about, you know, how legislators work, the short-term solutions need to stop. You know, a really good example is they're talking about now putting a rental cap on how much you can increase a rent in any rental property in Australia, right? It's a Greens initiative. On paper sounds great, you know, protecting the tenant, fantastic, no worries. The problem is that the actual result of that is that instead of negotiating with tenants, landlords will just terminate them at the end of the lease and get someone new in, which is much, much worse than having someone that you can talk to, negotiate, and develop a better relationship with, who's going to look after the property for a longer period of time. Obviously, you don't want them there for too long, but, you know, anyway.
Well, interesting segue, because I know that in our conversation prior, if a tenant's been there for too many years, so there's a clause that says, and correct me if I'm wrong, if the tenant's been there for 10+ years, their rights go up.
Correct. Yeah. So different states have different numbers of years that you've got to be in the property. But yes, they become what's called a protected tenant. And a protected tenant has significantly higher rights, including limitations on rent increases. But the biggest one that you guys are going to need to know about is the number of the amount of time you've got to give someone notice to vacate. At last that I had a tenancy where we were trying to get this tenant out, he had been in the property for 19 years and we had to give him 19 months notice to vacate.
19 months, folks, 19 months notice. That's crazy. So if you are a property developer and you have an existing tenant in there, you need to be asking the question, how long have they been there? Have I got a copy of the lease? And what lease history have they got? Because that is gonna hurt.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's crazy, isn't it? But yeah, that's because they've been there for so long. The government considers it their home, even though technically, you know, the name on the title might be different. And so they've put this in place. So it's a bit unfortunate for me to say, but I have to terminate tenancies that are coming up to the protected tenancy stage, because you cannot run the risk of that as an investor. You just can't.
Yeah. I mean, where you've had a long-term tenant like that, and they're clearly a good tenant because they've been there for that long, you don't want to do things like that. As a landlord, what can I do to keep the tenant, but I guess terminate that tenure being the 10-year plus. Is there any kind of loophole or structure or something that we can actually do to keep that good tenant there, and not penalize them for just reaching a threshold where it's actually convenient for them to keep staying?
I haven't heard of this, whether or not this is 100% true under the legislation or not, but there is a bit of information around, at least in New South Wales, where they say that by signing a new lease, you reset that. But whether or not that's been tried, it hasn't been tried in front of me in tribunal, is another case. I'm not sure.
What about signing a master lease, sublease type arrangement where somebody else signs the lease on their behalf and subleases it down to them? Is that plausible?
Yeah, that could absolutely work. Again, you run into more problems after another 10 years because tribunal considers subtenants to be tenants of the tenant, and therefore there's a tenancy in place. And you can get all wrapped up in the complexities of that. But yeah, no, that definitely would be, actually, that would be a fantastic solution if you wanted to keep someone there for that long. And yeah, you just sign a sort of a tiered arrangement.
Yeah, not go get legal advice, folks.
Yes.
Not advice. It's just an idea. I'll just spur of the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, mate. So let's assume that we've successfully navigated getting somebody into the property. They're, I guess, just about to come in. What could we do, should we do for regards to inspections on them coming in, routine maintenance and routine, I guess, checking that they're actually quality tenants in the first place? Because we think they are. We've got to prove that they are.
Yes. So with every lease, you've got to have your ingoing inspection, your outgoing inspection at the end, and then good property managers do regular inspections in between, just to make sure that they've got eyes on the property and that the property is being well maintained and looked after. Your ingoing inspection is probably the most important to set you up for success for the whole way through. So if you do a really in-depth ingoing inspection, and often property managers are very happy for you to be there for the ingoing as well. They take thousands, and I'm not joking, thousands of photos, lots of comments, and they just record every little piece of the property, because you never want to have happen that classic thing where it's like, oh, it was there when I moved in, and you have no proof to say, no, I'm sorry that hole in the wall was not there. You know what I mean? The next thing then is definitely your routine inspection. So I like to do mine 90 days in, so 3 months in. And the reason for that is that at that point they've settled in, hopefully they've finished unpacking, and they found most of the little things that might be not working, might be broken, and they can report that at the inspection as well. At that point, I then grade them. So if they're really, really good tenants, I might see them every 6 months. If they're not so great tenants, then I'll probably do the maximum amount that you can do in New South Wales, which is 4 inspections. That's not including re-inspections in the event that they have to, rectify a breach. But yeah, we've got a maximum of 4 here. So you'd go every 3 months and double check and check on and make sure that that the property's okay.
So you mentioned re-inspections. If you do one of your regular inspections and you find a problem and you issue them either a breach or a remedy of some description, that 4 that you just mentioned, we can go back and actually inspect that they've resolved that issue.
Yes.
How long, I guess, do we allow them to actually resolve that particular issue before we can come back?
Depends on the issue. Most people would say around 7 to 14 days. And that works quite well with your your weekly cycle. If you've gone and seen it on a Tuesday, that gives them until the next Tuesday to get it fixed. So, there's a weekend in between or something, depending on what the issue is. If it's a larger problem, then it might take longer. So, you do 14 days. But you'd always hope that it's something minor and that, you're going back just to double check later. Yeah.
Okay. So, in order to do our inspections, how much notice do we need to give them? Because I'm pretty suspicious that my guy is pretty rowdy and, not looking after his stuff. Like, can I just rock up on his door and go, freeze, it's the FBI, I'm coming in? Like, can we do that, or not quite so much?
Well, I mean, you can. You're just going to get a big fine from Fair Trading for doing it.
That's the answer.
The answer is no, you can't. So in New South Wales, it's 7 days notice in writing. That being said, there are little tips of the trade in order to get you in there a little bit earlier if needs be. So one really common thing.
Listen closely, folks. Tips of the trade. Let's go.
Tips of the trade. So one thing that we do if we've got a tenant who, for example, has stopped talking to us completely, they're not answering their phone, text messages or emails, you're allowed to inspect a property if you believe that there is imminent danger to that tenant or to the property. So we basically send them an email or a letter in the email saying, we are coming in because we believe that you are unsafe and the property is not safe because you're not responding to us. Usually they answer pretty quickly after that. And then you can go in without technically having any notice. The other thing that you can do is that I've seen done many, many times, and I think it's a great way to get in, is if you act as the small maintenance solution, right? So if you change light bulbs, if you're doing, a little bit of painting here and there, you can go in as the tradesperson for that and just have a little bit of a double check.
Yeah, so you're talking about the landlord going and doing those small repairs. So that's something that I do for my properties as well. So I don't get a chance to go into the properties on a regular basis, but if there's something minor, I don't want to pay an hour's labor to someone for changing a light bulb, but that's my excuse to get inside the property and both check to see that it's a good tenant, and also it's my ability to chat to the tenant and see if I've actually got a good property manager. So, and I've had tenants, and now that you tell me that 10-year rule, I'm going to go back and sanity check how long some of my tenants have been there. But I've had tenants 7, 8, 9 years. So approaching that 10-year mark, I need to go and sanity check that, mate.
Yeah, I think the fantastic thing is that you've had someone there for 7 or 8 years. That's a really big testament to obviously how that they are treated as tenants and that they love living there, and that obviously it's going to be a great investment for you, right? But yeah, you've got to balance all these things, right? Whether or not it's going to work for you in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've done an inspection, we've found some things wrong, and I guess need to do some maintenance on the properties and that sort of thing. As a property manager, I'm assuming that you're giving reports to say, hey, this stuff is broken and the like. How does that physically work? What's the process there?
So when we do the inspection and we're noticing that there are issues or rectifications or things that we need to get addressed, there's two different things that you need to do in that instance. Number one is that you are actually looking what there is and what there will be. So what there is, you can see it's broken, what have you. What there will be is that, the carpet is getting towards the end of its life cycle and it might be worth changing within the next year, 2 years or what have you. And those two things, kind of for me as a property manager makes us stand out because it means that we're looking at it strategically. And you can look at the list of how long something's supposed to last and make a decision based on basically what the government says to how long you can depreciate an asset for. And at that point, you're going to get that tax benefit back, so you can go in and get that changed.
Yeah, you mentioned that. So for everyone out there, you can depreciate assets that I guess start to have wear and tear and that sort of thing. And the government, the ATO, gives us a rental property guide, and so page 37 of that guide gives us a little bit of an overview. And here's a picture, a little bit of an overview of how long things actually last. And so how long we can actually start to depreciate our things over. So you'll get a quantity surveyor to come in and they'll assess the entire property and say how many curtains, how much carpet, all those sorts of things. And they'll start to then give you what they call a depreciation schedule. Now, this is a copy of that schedule. It goes for many, many pages. I'm not going to go into it in particular, but noticed a little idiosyncrasy before, didn't we, Alex, in having a look at this, where if it was acquired before the 1st of July 2004, if it's a clock that is electric, it lasts for 13 and a third years. But somehow, if it was acquired after 2019, it doesn't last as long. It only lasts 10 years now. So
yep, they don't build them like they used to, mate.
They don't build them like they used to. So make sure that you're looking at those sorts of things, folks, and seeing, I guess, where your assets, where they're starting to wear and tear. I think firstly, you want to make sure that you're getting the best tax return that you can. So if you're no longer able to claim a tax return from it, it's not serving you. And if it's dilapidated and that sort of thing, it's not going to generate the rent that you want because the property is not going to be in good condition. So make sure that you're doing those things to actually, I guess, maximize the return that you can actually get, both from a tax deductibility perspective and also from a rental attractiveness perspective.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. What else, mate, from a maintenance perspective? Any do's and don'ts that you should do when looking at your maintenance?
Yeah, really, really important is that you are maintaining control over your maintenance, whether or not you're sending your tradespeople out, or if you're looking at the property or what have you. Like, don't rely on the tenant to go and fix the problem and send you an invoice later. That's really, really important, that you are the one who controls how your money is being used.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, don't let them change that light bulb themselves. If they get electrocuted, you're in trouble. Lots and lots of trouble. Plus, you don't know how dodgy a repair they're going to do, and that sort of thing. So it's, nor do you know the quality of the work that they're going to do.
Yeah, you just can't guarantee it.
Absolutely. So, okay, we've got a tenant in place. I guess everything is going well. We're maintaining the property relatively well. What are some of the risks that we need to consider, I guess, on the ongoing maintenance of the property, making sure that it's actually in a, insurances and things like that? What are the things that we need to make sure that we've actually got in place to make sure that we're legally compliant, covering ourselves and doing all the right things?
Yeah, so there's a couple of certificates and compliance items that you really need to have checked off with every tenancy. The most important ones for every single property, at least in New South Wales, is smoke alarm compliance. So that's where you have someone go in, they check the smoke alarm, make sure that it's installed in the right place, and so on and so forth. You've got things like pool certificates, making sure that they're safe, and also probably upon that is having all of your insurances and stuff in place to make sure that you're protected. It is a small amount per year, depending on the size of your property, but it will cover you for so much in case something goes wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And different kinds of insurances that sit in and around all of that. So depending upon the kind of rental products that you actually have. So if you're renting as a individual house versus if you're renting with subleases versus if you're renting per room versus if you're renting short stay for Airbnb versus all sorts of things. So different kind of landlord's insurance that sit over all of that, mate.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah, so you've got landlord's insurance as a product itself, where you've really got to be reading that PDS to make sure that you know exactly what you're covered for and what you're not. So really good example, a couple of years ago, I had one where for some strange reason, the PDS didn't cover wooden fences. It only covered metal fences for some strange reason. Who knows why? And that your rent is secure as well. But if you've got a house, you need building and contents, if you've got a strata apartment, then your strata corporation will have the building insurance instead. So all of these things come together. If you've got a larger property, I often recommend legal liability insurance as well, in case someone is going to hurt themselves in the property. So, fall down a flight of stairs or something like that, then you're covered for medical costs and so on and so forth.
So there's, because this is for property developers doing rental properties, at some point, we're going to want to have vacant possession of the property, and then you can't actually insure a vacant property. So strange as it might seem. So you want to make sure that you're timing this really, really well, folks. Now, typically you'll find that a lot of the typical landlord's insurance and that sort of thing might cover for a period of maybe a maximum of a month for untenanted properties, with the anticipation that you're trying to re-tenant it. But if you are not re-tenanting it, so make sure you're still advertising that you're trying to re-tenant it. So if it goes past that period and then somebody burns that house down or something happens, then you potentially are not going to be covered. So time your project well so that period is very minimalistic as much as humanly possible. There's a couple of other elements that I had a brainwave on that during the process that has now just fallen completely out of my head, Alex. So I'm just kind of padding here to try and find what it was thinking. But When you actually knock the house down, another one is you actually need insurance on the vacant land in case somebody trips over a rock or something along those lines. So make sure that that's actually the case. But
make friends with the general insurance broker, basically.
Absolutely, and they'll be changing the kind of insurance that you have at many stages during the process as you go from rental property through to vacant property through to vacant land through to construction. The type of insurance is going to change significantly. So yes, you need a insurance broker as part of your team. The one that I was going to say is the condition of the property. In Queensland, it's recently come in that it actually has to be a habitable dwelling in the first instance. So, if it's not habitable, then, you're putting people's lives in danger and that sort of thing. So make sure that you've done the appropriate building and pest inspections before putting a tenant in, folks. The other thing is if you have the wrong kind of insurance. So if, for example, you have landlord's insurance and you're renting per room, let it be known that the insurance company will happily take your premium.
Yeah.
And they will say nothing. And you might even disclose the fact that you're doing the rent per room, but because the PDS does not cover that, you will have no right of claim against it. So make sure that your insurance provider is very aware of what it is that you're doing and you have the right product in place.
Yeah.
Whilst the insurance broker will actually, navigate that for you, please read your insurance policies yourself.
They're boring documents, but they're so important. Important. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned a couple of other ones that might be incoming legislation. So in different states, things like electricity and gas compliance.
It was interesting that you mentioned that the habitableness of a certain property. So here in New South Wales, the wording that we've got is that it's reasonably, you've got reasonable ventilation or reasonable amount of lighting and stuff like that. In other states, I'm aware that there's been changes whereby you've actually got to get a professional in to check things like your wiring and do a safety check for the electricity and the plumbing and the gas and so on and so forth, to make sure that there's no leaks and that there's no, shorting wires and what have you. At this stage at New South Wales, we are still at a position whereby that can be asserted by the person doing the inspection for the ingoing inspection, because we know what a broken PowerPoint looks like or what have you, or if we can smell gas, you know what I mean? You don't need a plumber to do that. But it's always a good idea to get your building and pest done anyway. If you're purchasing a property, you should be doing that regardless, right? But having that available then for a tenant when they move in is just that sort of cherry on top for them. Often they feel super confident.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've got a tenant in, we've done their inspections, we're appropriately insured, all those sorts of things. At this point, we've got ourselves a shitty tenant. We did all the right checks, but now we're at the point where we want this person out. Okay, what is it that we can do with regards to breaches? What are the kinds of things that we can, lodge breaches on? Firstly, what is a breach? And, how many times do we need to notify them? All that sort of stuff to go, I want this joker out.
Yeah. So a breach is essentially formal notice from the landlord or the agent that some part of the contract has been contravened. So when you breach someone, you're serving them a document that says you have breached the agreement in this way at this point of time, and this is what we seek as compensation or what have you as a result of this breach. Tribunal is going to want to see at least 3 breaches before you can serve a termination notice. There are specific termination notices that can go out without having breaches in place. So a really good example is like arrears. If you are in arrears, you can be terminated after 14 days of being in arrears. But technically being 1 day in arrear is a breach. But you're not going to be going through the process of doing 3 breaches because the person is 3 days late, because you have to get to that 14 days in order to terminate. So unless otherwise specified, again, this is New South Wales specifically, unless otherwise specified, your ability to breach and your ability to terminate can be somewhat separated. Another really big one is where tenants don't notify you of damage that's happening to the property. So, for example, you've got a leak in the roof that has been happening for months, and it's obvious that it's been happening for months because the paint has dried and then, done that thing where it gets bubbly. that's a breach because the tenant has not informed, and it's a longer amount of cost in the end. They are actually probably going to be liable for that cost that they haven't caused because it was the natural elements that did that, but they didn't notify you. And then, so those are big ones. And then the other, probably the most common one in any big city is noise complaints and preventing other people around them from having quiet enjoyment. Those are breaches. A lot of people sort of hand wave them and they say, oh, it's just, the agent is being, sensitive or something like that. But they're genuine breaches. You have to act in a certain way in the area. So, you can't make noise after certain time periods and so on and so forth.
Well, I mean, having parties, that sort of house, that sort of thing in the house is one thing where noise complaints can actually come from. But what happens if it's a quiet party, mate, and they just happen to have 20 mates around playing poker? They're nice and quiet, and a few mates sleep on the couch. Is there a maximum number of people that are allowed in the property? How long is that maximum period allowed for? Did the poker match go for one day? Did it go for a week? I don't know.
Yeah, so really, really important to remember that as an investor, you set how many people are allowed to live in your property, right? So if you've got 4-bedroom house, 4 people, if you're comfortable with it, I would never recommend it. If you're comfortable with 8 people because you've got 4 couples or something, you can set that. So the tenant agrees to that when they sign the lease. So if you've agreed to 3 people in the property, then 3 people living in the property ordinarily is all that can live there. And you end up with subtenants situations sometimes that people are more or less comfortable with. I'm always a big proponent of that, subtenants can work if you've got a large enough property, so long as we are always kept informed as to who that person is. So I always ask the tenant, I said, listen, if you're going to sublet to the second room to a friend or to someone, at least have them apply. At least have them send me all their documentation and who they are, for 2 reasons. Number one, the landlord has a right to know who's living in their property. But number 2, if something goes wrong, if the place burns down or there's been, a bad storm and you've got bad leaking, if they call my office and they're not listed on the lease, my office won't speak to them because it's a privacy issue at that point.
Yeah. So we've got a shitty tenant. Look, they didn't pay rent this week. They had a party last week. They've got too many mates staying over all the time. There's my 3 strikes. They're out, right? Is it as simple as that?
Not quite, unfortunately. They've got to strike 3 times in the same vein. So they've got to do 3 bad parties and be, late on the rent 3 times, unfortunately. And tribunal will want a warning as well on top of that. Often it's not actually written into the legislation, but when I've been to the general, because they have these sort of group hearings where you hear all the other cases at the same time, they often ask, did you give the tenant a warning before you issued the breach?
So 3 strikes on the same thing,
Yes.
And yet they're being shitty all over the place. How do I guess, kind of broaden what this breach might be in the language that I use so that I can be a little bit more inclusive? Let's just say that some of the breaches are the same breach.
Yeah. If you remember from the beginning when I talked about it's a contravention of the contract, a breach, that's what it is. If you word your breach in that way that you have contravened the contract in a general enough way, there'll be enough overlap where the 3 breaches will be logically linear. And then you can apply for a termination as a result of 3 linear breaches.
Good to know, folks. Make sure your property manager is high on the spoken language and written language when they're lodging there, and I guess kind of cluster those up, because otherwise, I've had property managers in the past where I've had shitty tenants and we haven't been able to get rid of them because they didn't do things like that. So, lesson learned from me: don't do that, folks. Okay, at this point, we've issued breach. We want them out. They're refusing to get out. We've got to take them to tribunal. You mentioned tribunal. In every state, that has a slightly different name. So in New South Wales, it's NCAT. In Victoria, it's VCAT. In Queensland, it's QCAT. Seems to be a cat everywhere I go. Hoping I haven't got any cat allergies. So what is the power that these different tribunals have, and how much of that is actually enforceable? What kind of things go there, and what sort of things do we need to actually take to a higher court?
So the CAT part of the NCAT, VCAT, and so on is civil and administrative tribunal, right? So they really care about things that are civil and administrative. So don't worry about criminal stuff. It's going to be small scale. It's court light, if that makes sense, and they've got limits as to what they're allowed to actually enforce and what they can claim for. So the monetary limit in New South Wales is $15,000, right? Anything higher than that, you've got to go to local court, and it's actually a civil proceeding at that point. So this kind of fast justice approach with the CATs, it really is designed to be more of a mediative experience where people come together into a room. They actually force you to mediate now before you have a hearing, which is fair enough. Most of my cases that I've ever been to tribunal have been solved in mediation. And their goal really is to get it done as quickly as possible. They don't want to be going to a hearing. They don't want to be spending time reading through all your documents and so on and so forth, because it's a lot of work for them, and they've got KPIs. But yeah, there's interesting issues with how enforceable it is. So one thing that's a little bit of an open secret is that if you live in a separate state so for example, if the landlord lives in a separate state to where the property is, anything that is decided by tribunal is invalid because they're not they don't live in the state where that tribunal is. So, we've had to get around that on occasion by having landlords list their local address as like a friend's address or something like that in order to make something valid. But yeah, it's more of a scare tactic than anything else, to be honest. Most of the time, if you send a notice of application to tribunal to a tenant, they end up paying their dues because they don't want a mark against them in case it ever goes onto their, background check or something like that. Yeah.
In case it goes onto their ticker.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so the fear of it going onto ticker and then impacting them not being able to get somewhere else to live is very high.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you said they are somewhat toothless, but are they going to be looking after my best interests? This person has been a terrible tenant. They've done all sorts of things to my property. They've not paid on rent. Is tribunal actually going to be on my side, do you think?
All tribunals across the entire country are to be considered a hostile environment to investors. It's a bit of a sad thing to say, but their opinion of a landlord is an old, rich, white guy with a long beard who sends out rental increases and just sits at home all day enjoying his multi-million-dollar view. The fact of the matter is that most investors are mum and pop investors trying to do what everyone else is trying to do and give themselves some form of financial security into the future. So I think I could count on one hand in my 8 years being in real estate how many of those landlords with the long white beards I have actually dealt with. They're very, very uncommon, but tribunal still thinks that the landlord is the bad guy, that they're the evil one trying to take the bond, trying to, you know what I mean? Whereas, you forget that a fairly significant amount of damage to a property can be done in a very short period of time. And at $15,000 recourse, that's not very much. So you've got to get in there quick and you've got to be super organized, very, very clear on what you want from the tenant. You actually have to narrow the scope of discussions, because what happens very frequently, when people complain about stuff, they start bringing in this, that, and the other, and everything just sort of snowballs.
Kitchen sinking it.
Exactly. Whereas as if you've got a good property manager who's been to tribunal and they know how to do this, you can actually narrow that focus and say, no, we're not talking about that. We're talking about this. And it really, really does make a big difference. Another quick tip, I had a case a few years ago now where the tenant provided a statutory declaration from a friend of his who was in carport import and export into Australia as to how bad a carpet was. So we had a particular carpet in the property. He destroyed it. And the statutory declaration from this person, who is obviously a very successful carpet importer into the country, was that this was one of the worst carpets you could possibly put into a tenancy. Don't take a tenant's evidence as gospel. You can have it thrown out. What I did, I asked the guy through another way, like he didn't know who I was. I managed to go around the issue. I got him to give me a quote and all of the certificates of that particular carpet, where he said that it was the best kind of carpet you can possibly put in a tenancy, and therefore it was. And I presented that as evidence alongside. So you can actually get something removed completely if you do go to tribunal. Be a bit of a lawyer about it, if you know what I mean. Like, feel free to object and say no. I mean, there are times you can talk and times you're not supposed to, but be strategic, I guess, is the most important thing when you go to tribunal.
Tribunal's meant to avoid the lawyers, but you've got to think like one.
Yes.
Is what you're saying. So it's trying to keep the costs low so that it's actually affordable for both sides.
Yeah.
But
I've seen lawyers thrown out of tribunal hearings before because people bring them and they say, I don't want to, the member just says, I don't want to talk to you. You're not supposed to be here. Leave. And they actually make them leave. So here's a joke for you. What's the difference between a catfish and a lawyer? I don't know.
One's a scum-sucking bottom dweller, and the other one's a fish.
Yeah, considering the lawyers I've met. Yep.
I know a lot of really good lawyers out there, and please, tongue-in-cheek, folks. Okay, now for property developers specifically, we're trying to do lots of things. We're trying to, I guess, in most instances, we're trying to add some value while the property has some ability to actually obtain some rent, and then potentially knock the place down. So we want tenants in there to reduce our holding costs. Then we want them out of there as quick as humanly possible. So there's a few little gotchas for us along the way. So some of the things that you might be wanting to do, depending upon, I guess, how long you think it's going to take you to get to the point of construction, folks, is you might ask for vacant possession up front when you're actually trying to purchase the property in the first instance. That might take a little bit of time based on what you were saying, Alex, if there's a protected tenant in there. So make sure you do your homework to make sure that that protected tenant doesn't exist, and know what the appropriate notification period is in doing that. Now, if there is a tenant that is in place and they are not protected and they are on a fixed term contract, what is typically the notification period that you need to give them in order to vacate the property?
Yeah, in New South Wales, at the end of a fixed term tenancy, it's 30 days notice. 30
days notice. If that then, I guess, migrates across to be, I guess, an ongoing or a periodic lease at that point, they had to give us more notice to vacate. I'm assuming that we also have to give them more notice to vacate as well. Yes.
So their notice period on the fixed term is 14 days and then 21 days off. Ours is 30 days on and 90 days off.
90 days, folks. So you want to make sure that you are looking at your leases, that you're, I guess, reviewing them on a regular basis to make sure that they are going to align up with when you think that development approval is going to come through, when you think you're actually going to be construction ready or shovel ready to actually move forward. So please, please, please do the planning, work with your property manager, and also work with your tenant to make sure that they are aware of what the process is and that you can and will be wanting to move them on at some point. And then where appropriate, incentivize them to actually move on in the timeline that you actually want to do that. Look at, well, what is the cost of the holding cost for 90 days? What is that holding cost going to be for me? And am I better to pay the relocation cost for that person? Because, you know, paying interest on a $2 million property for that period of time is probably going to be as cheap, or sorry, as expensive, or if not more, than it would be to actually pay for the removalist guy to come in and actually take them to somewhere else. Right? So how do we actually help them out? So also start to consider that whilst you are waiting for development approval, subject to which council you're actually in, sometimes they're very, very fast with their development approval processes. Sometimes they're very, very slow. So you want to have a very clear understanding from your town planner what that anticipated timeline is, given the complexity of your deal. and then start to consider whether or not you want to have a tenant in there in order to mitigate the holding costs versus the hassle factor of the notifications and all that sort of thing. So sometimes the risk isn't worth the reward. Other times it is. You need to make a very informed decision about that. Make sure that you've got a very good property manager helping in doing so along the way. Now, some other things that would be of interest for property developers is, hey, we need to sell our finished product at the end. And depending upon the demographic of the area that we're actually developing in, sometimes we're selling it to owner-occupiers and sometimes we're selling it to investors. So there are things called rental guarantees when we sell that have, in the past, been used very regularly as incentives to get investors to purchase our properties. I'm sure that you've got some commentaries of having seen the other sides of these transactions, but the intent here is that we want to prop up the value of the property as much as humanly possible by reassuring the incoming person that the rent is able to sustain the value of the property. And so what I have seen done in the past, and you need to be very careful with legislation in each state as to whether or not you can actually do these sorts of incentives, because some states you can and some states you can't. But you might have a rental guarantee that is a little bit inflated. That's going to cost you a little bit from a cash flow perspective as the developer, but you're offsetting that by holding up or propping up the value of the property. Now, you might only need to do that for one in the entire complex, because once you've actually got that first sale now reflects the value of the potential for the rest of the properties that are actually sitting out there. So, sometimes it's, you might prop it up by $100 a week, and that might cost you, say, $5,000 over the entire year. That might give you an extra 10,000, 15,000 for the property, multiplied by how many have I got in the complex. So look at doing those things. Make sure you speak to your solicitor. Make sure you've got the legislation that will support you in being able to give those sorts of incentives. On the other side of the transaction, where the property manager is now looking after a rental guarantee, what have you seen from the other side of things, Alex, where an incoming investor has got one of these rental guarantees? What have you seen?
Well, it essentially gives you the confidence. Do you know what I mean? That's probably the most important thing. When you remove the risk from that kind of transaction, it's the value is there for them to be able to say, yep, no worries, this is a good idea. I think probably when looking at rental guarantees, tenants move into a property for what it is now and where it is now and what's around it now, the infrastructure and so on and so forth. People often purchase with a view of what's going to be in the future. So, if you're in a hospital precinct, for example, and things are still being built, then you might not necessarily expect that there's going to be a large number of tenants who are interested to go into that area, but they will be. And so therefore a rental guarantee is really, really, really important to be able to hold that price up, as you mentioned, and sort of bolster it. So I think anywhere that you can give an investor confidence, you're going to win.
Absolutely. Mate, I think we've given this a fairly good rounding. I guess for anyone needing to rent or wanting to rent a property out, who's looking to select a good property manager, give them some tips and tricks into how do you actually choose a good, property manager? What are the things that you're actually looking for?
So a good property manager is going to be a balance between attention to detail and strategic thinking. So they're not going to get bogged down too much in the nitty gritty, but they're aware it's there and they can use that towards creating a perfect strategy for you. Don't be afraid to ask them as many questions as you like. Really good property managers have a ton of stories. I always like to think that one day someone will sit down with me from a screenwriter's point of view and we'll make a dark comedy about my industry because of the amount of stuff that we go through. But yeah, we have a lot of stories and we can use quite a lot of what we know because we talked a lot about legislation today and about what you can and you cannot do, but there's so many gray areas and areas where you can do things that like top tips and so on and so forth to get around what is the more obvious part of why that legislation is there to get you the best result.
Absolutely, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure, I guess, picking your brain and getting all of that knowledge out there. For any developers that are out there that need to do rentals along the way, if you are in, I guess, the greater Sydney regional area, I'm sure Alex would love to hear from you. But mate, it's been a pleasure. Now, for anyone else who is watching our show, make sure that you come back every week. We always have a different issue, challenge, or topic that we're always looking for. And we also run regular monthly meetups all the way around the country. If you want to come to one of our events, then click on that link below, come to our events. We run those in Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne, where you can hear from industry experts just like Alex, talking about all sorts of different issues and challenges around the country for everything in and around your property development space. So, mate, been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your candor, and I'm very much enjoying the process. I'm going to say till then, folks, bye for now.
Thank you very much.